Hello everyone, this is Kat, and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 39, chapter 39, entitled, I'll Let You Lie to Me. You have a hairbrush, yes? Because combing your fingers through that mess and calling it a day will not have a great impression on Gran Torino. Yes, you saw me put it in my bag, Midori hissed under his breath, readjusting his school backpack for extra pointedness. You're starting to sound like Yamada-sensei. Gami scoffed, flipping his hood with a hand dramatically like he had long hair. Well, excuse me for trying to make sure that you do not forget anything. The teen shrugged, switching the briefcase with his hero costume in it to his other hand. Even if I did, what could I do about it now? His mentor groaned loudly, turning away from him in a pronounced fashion to really get his annoyance across, but even if he'd hate to admit it, Midori was right. What could he do now as they stood impatiently within the train station, all his classmates in tow, waiting for the trains to take them to an experience of a lifetime? Maybe it was just the oozing nervousness and excitement that infected the air. Maybe it was infecting him too, as sick as a ghost could possibly get. All right, Aizawa called out from the group front, collecting the attention of 20 hyper high schoolers plus one equally eager ghost. You've all got your costumes, right? A wave of briefcases arose from the mountain range of heads, and numbers all out of order, but certainly 1 to 20. Gami had to help his successor raise his, since Midori was stubbornly trying to manage with just one hand. His other held tightly onto Gran Torino's internship offer, the exact piece of paper that All Might had given him in the hallway last week, as well as his corresponding train ticket. He really had tried to give the other offers a chance, judging by the way he'd nearly filled up half a notebook in these past few days, but his heart had been swayed instantly. It was almost too good to be true, the possibility of being taught how to control the blasts instead of trying to figure it out himself, the promise of new mobility outside of raw athletic prowess, even the childhood excitement of anything All Might related, that never seemed to go away no matter how much he wanted to grow out of it. It all seemed too good to be true, except it was true, fully tangible and practically placed in the palms of his hands. An old pre-UA Midoriya would have never imagined himself even considering this in the first place, but here he was actually thrilled to start what could be the most life-changing week of his life. On second hand, maybe not. He had one too many life-changing moments so far to wish for any more. Obviously, wearing them in public is prohibited, unless given explicit permission from the hero that you're interning with, the underground hero stressed, looking a little more tired than usual, and Midori couldn't blame him, not when adrenaline flooded even his typically slow-moving veins. And don't lose them either. Oh goodness, with these children, Gami echoed Aizawa's distress. One can only hope. Have some more faith in us. What are you, a middle-aged dad? Yes, I know. He finished for him. For someone as creative as you seem to like repeating the same thing over and over. Midori's instinctual, overdramatic gasp was thankfully drowned out by the ecstatic cries of his peers. Make sure to mind your manners and don't go burning anything down. I'll see you all in a week. With that, Midori almost expected his teacher to retreat into his signature yellow sleeping bag, but this was not the classroom, so he merely waved tiredly and retreated out of the train station entirely. And just like that, Gami had activated full-on parent mode, hovering over his successor's shoulder to get a closer look at his ticket. It says you're to wait at Gate C for the train station to Yamanashi. We should make our way there. We have time. The train doesn't leave for another 15 minutes. Midori nodded his head up to the screen, showing the schedule of incoming and departing trains. I want to wish off Uraraka, Iida, and Shoto if I can find him. Gami started screeching something about that really not being a lot of time, but Midori walked away anyways. Passed by excited classmates who barely seemed to notice him in all their eagerness, he was knowing that his mentor was right to an extent, but he at least wanted to check on Iida before leaving. He tried to push away the anxiety that had been brewing in the pits of his stomach with every shadowed gaze, fake smile, and dismissive wave that Iida had sent him, but he just couldn't stop worrying. He'd always been a worrier. It came with the job. Death gave him so much to worry about, and it wasn't just people dying that had him so anxious. It was that he could unknowingly push past normal human limits again and kill his hero career before it even started. It was that Gami couldn't remember anything about himself or the last 500 years of his life. It was that he just now realized he might have some unnatural curse placed upon him that was changing people in his life for the worse. And the sudden shift in Iida that was completely unlike his personality, for his normally talkative, responsible, diligent friend to be so distant. He was so worried that it was the last thing on his anxiety list, rearing its ugly head, and as much as Gami tried to convince him not to. Oh, hey, Midori. Uraraka had called out to him from a little ways away, rushing toward him with a smile. I was looking for you. I wanted to wish you good luck with Gran Torino. Her bubbliness eased some of the draining worry from his heart. Thanks, I was looking for you too, actually. Can't wait to see how you come back from Gunhead. Uraraka threw some mock punches. You guys won't even be able to recognize me. They laughed at their antics, and for a moment it was like worry didn't exist anymore. Iida, there you are. And then it all came back. Iida turned around stiffly, the harsh overhead light refracting uncomfortably from his glasses. His lips were pursed together tightly, his eyebrows furrowed, almost like it was physically painful to look at them. At him. Midori didn't realize that Gami had caught up to him until he felt that familiar chill on his shoulder, and the sensation reminded him to breathe once again. Hey, Iida. You can always talk to us. The silent to me echoed around the bustling train station. We're friends, after all. Iida didn't respond for a moment, and while it was merely a second, impossible to be anything more, the shadow that morphed into a smile on his face absolutely terrified him. Sure. It was all so fake Midori nearly choked on it. Their friend didn't even spare them another glance, turning to walk away toward his train station. His gait was hostile and unwelcoming, smothered in suffocating shadows that left both Midori and Uraraka sinking into discomfort for such an exciting day. They shared a knowing glance, much like the ones he shared with his mentor, before Uraraka offered a pitiful smile. Have fun, okay? She reminded him. Don't forget to call me sometime. Midori tried to chuckle, but it came out more like a sad wheeze. I've got your number, don't worry. I think I have everyone's number, actually, other than Bakugo. She started to walk off in the opposite direction. Well, check in with them too. I've got to get going. He waved her goodbye until they could see her fleeting form no longer, feeling a little more resolved with the current take of events, and that was until Gami tugged impatiently on his sleeve. We have to get going. Midori glanced up at the clock. Shit, you're right. I always am. Gami didn't miss an opportunity to quip, even under the time crunch. Now move. So the teen listened, speed walking in the opposite direction Uraraka had left him. Thankfully his train was departing out of Gate C, so the walk wasn't far. There was no need to run, despite Gami's cries for him to do so, lugging around his school backpack full of essentials for the week, as well as his costume briefcase. It certainly wasn't an incentive to change his pace anyway. The gate had invited itself to his sight, and Gami had rushed off on his own. The train is not here yet. You were so stupidly lucky. But Midori was confused when Gami cut himself off, tempted to yell out to him, even though they were in the middle of a busy train station, tasting the acidic nervousness creeping back up his throat. But the ghost bounced back before he even had a chance to ask if something was wrong. Just get over here. You will not believe who's waiting for you. Waiting for me? What? Midori approached the gate, slowing down his pace. As he looked at the waiting area, his words were caught in his throat like a heavy rock, awkward and uncomfortable. Todoroki, who sat on the right side of the waiting area, waved to him softly, no smile on his face, and yet a comfortable look of contentness in his heterochromatic eyes. And Iida, who sat on the left of the waiting area, glanced up at him through the corner of his eyes, out of instinct only, and, upon recognizing him, obviously fought to repress a scowl. Needless to say, Midori scurried over to the right side, placing himself beside Todoroki in an attempt to soothe the discomfort that came from the nasty look that Iida kept sending him from the edges of his glasses. Izuku? Todoroki turned to him quietly, leaning in slightly, naturally. I didn't expect to see you before I left. Midori laughed under his breath. Well, you sort of ran off before I could say goodbye, but I guess it worked out since Gran Torino is in the same direction as wherever you're going. Endeavor. Midori did a double take, not quite processing what he just heard. What? Endeavor. That's who I'm interning with. Todoroki clarified. He's got an office around an hour out, near Hosu, actually. Neither teen noticed Iida's head perk up, something nauseating in his eyes, like a tantalizing glint of maliciousness that didn't belong. So you decided on Endeavor. Well, I hope you find the opportunities you're looking for. Midori gave him a small smile, one of his childish grins that radiated purity. If you need anything, even just to talk. He pulled out his phone from his uniform pocket, giving it a little wave in front of Todoroki, who couldn't resist a creeping smile of his own. The sweet air was infectious, and between the two of them it was a comforting normalcy. I know. Thank you, Izuku. And that was all he needed to say for the two of them to understand completely. A sudden break at the intercom startled them out of their moment in time, and the screeching of iron brakes was more of a sign that the train was arriving than the bold letters flashing on the screen ahead. "The train is here," Gami bounced excitedly, tugging on his successor's sleeve. "Come on, we have not ridden a train in such a long time." Giggling under his breath, Midoriya shook his head playfully, standing up to grab his costume briefcase. Todoroki stood not a moment after, pulling his ticket out and securing his backpack across his shoulders. Iida had long entered the train without them, but Todoroki waited for Midoriya to gather himself so they could walk on together. Iida obviously placed himself far from the entry point of the train, and quite honestly, Midoriya was content with leaving him to his own space. Clearly something was bothering his normally socially outgoing friend. That's something more likely than not the issue of the hero killer attacking his brother. That's something more likely than not somewhat related to the maybe curse that Gami had speculated with him about. So Midoriya was more than fine with letting Iida try to simmer down on his own, even with his stomach flipping in on itself with worry, just because he wasn't sure how many nasty glares his heart could take anymore. But Todoroki had led him right to the seats across from Iida and sat himself down, and out of an even greater fear of being alone right now, Midoriya sat next to him. The train doors had closed after an eternity, and with another ear-piercing screech, the train pulled itself from the station, but even with the jerk of a start, Iida's eyes kept themselves firmly locked on Midoriya's fidgety form, almost burning straight through him. Unsure of why his friend was acting this way, or maybe he knew but just didn't want to admit it to himself, he did the only thing he knew how when faced with every close person in his life who no longer wanted him. He tried to pretend that it didn't bother him. "So, Iida," he started small and shakily, "who are you interning with?" Iida didn't move, continuing to stare robotically into him like his very existence was a nuisance. "Manuel." Midoriya cocked his head in light surprise. Manuel wasn't a hero name he heard quite often. Quite the opposite, really. And he's a typical middle-ranking hero with an effective water-based quirk, especially noted with working closely with local fire and police as a rescue asset. He didn't see exactly how Iida would really fit working with a hero like that, but then again, he didn't quite understand how Uraraka and Gunhead would fit together either, but he had trusted her judgment. Maybe that was the difference. "Oh, what made you choose him?" He tried not to remember that Manuel operated out of Hosu. He tried not to remember that Hosu was where the hero killer's recent attacks were, and he tried not to remember what the hero killer had done to Iida's brother. He tried not to remember that look in Iida's eyes that was starting to become all too familiar, that look that reminded him too much of... "What does it matter to you?" Iida snapped violently, all that pent-up hatred suddenly exploding from his lips like acid. "Stop sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." And just like that, Midoriya convinced himself to stop sticking his nose where it most certainly did belong. He shrank back into his skin, almost wanting to retreat into his bones like Shinso's quirk made him do. He should have known. What was he doing poking a bear and expecting not to get hurt? But this was Iida, his calm and rational friend. Then again, the student in front of him certainly didn't appear like Iida anymore, not with those spiteful eyes, boring into him so intensely. Todoroki shifted in his seat, having witnessed the interaction before him, racked with uncomfortable uneasiness. He moved to say something to Iida, but was shut down by a hesitant touch to his knee. He looked to his side, only to see Midoriya staring at him directly and shaking his head. Midoriya eased slightly as Todoroki reclined his back into his train seat again, and he was catching a sigh of relief. The last thing he wanted was to start something where the three of them were stuck into a measly train car. Things were tense as it was. He certainly didn't want to escalate anything, not without a clear train of thought in mind. "So, a train and a car are nearly one and the same, correct?" Gami began all of a sudden, completely off topic and almost uncaring of what had transpired, and nearly transpired between them. "The train merely being larger in size, with a typically longer duration of travel." Caught off guard, Midoriya's normally nearly non-existent nod stuttered, coming across as nothing more than a jerk of balance from the train. His uniform pocket buzzed unexpectedly, reining in his wayward attention to the phone that he was pulling out onto his lap. It was a text from Todoroki. Confused, he turned to his friend next to him, but upon getting no reaction, he clicked on the message instead. "Hey, are you all right? You look a little shaken from Iida's outburst." "Oh, okay, he was just trying to circumvent the elephant in the room, quietly and discreetly," Midoriya typed back. "I'm good, thanks. Wasn't expecting Iida to react like that, but I guess he's still under a lot of stress with his brother and everything." And everything didn't even begin to describe what Midoriya was sure was working behind the scenes. Patiently he watched out of the corner of his eye as Todoroki typed away on his phone, playing it off like he was scrolling through something instead. "If that is to be assumed true, then why is it that I can comfortably ride alongside you on a train, but not when you ride in a car?" Midori didn't even grace his mentor with a response, not that he could have even if he wanted to, and instead looked down at his phone upon feeling it vibrate against his hand. Is Iida acting like I did at the sports festival? The phone nearly slipped out of his hand, but he steadied it hastily as it buzzed again. Before you helped me to snap out of it, that is. I don't really remember most of it other than what had happened in our fight. He could feel his throat dry faster than a desert at noon, his nervous swallow grinding uncomfortably against sandpaper lining. His fingers hesitated over the keys. He didn't want to say yes. He didn't want to admit to his gut that all his worrying was right. He wanted the whole thing to just be grief and anger and injustice, and not at him. Because the moment he faced that truth, that Iida's hateful stares really were directed toward him, that he wasn't just an unfortunate recipient of a misdirected sorrow, he was back in the unknown. And God did the unknown terrify him, when he already held so little and lost so much. He could feel Gami's chilly air move closer to him, reading the screen over his shoulder, and then shivered slightly as the atmosphere had dropped in temperature for a second. In a sick sort of exasperation, Midori was a little tired of Gami being right. Gami moved away from him, returning to a recline in his train of thought. I mean, at face value, the obvious answer is because the train is larger, so it can hold me more comfortably than the backseat of a car, but with what we've established at the nature of my ghostliness, that should not matter. Shaking himself out of his thoughts, and whatever the hell Gami was going on about, Midoriya hashed in something that would satisfy the churning in his stomach and the quivering of his fingers. Why? In his haste, the response came off a little more aggressive and defensive than he intended. What do you mean? Better, a start, he supposed. In theory, I should remain in my position relative to the Earth, as the train cars should pass through me until the train leaves me behind. I thought that maybe my link to you may be the reason that I'm able to ride the train, but why would that not work with the car as well? Midoriya had to restrain from gritting his teeth. It wasn't all Gami's fault. He was undeniably stressed right now, and his normal tolerance was at an all-time low, but couldn't he take a hint? There was so much shit more important currently than what he was talking about regarding his ability to ride the train. As fair of a question as it was. The buzz came in thankfully not long later, and Midoriya quickly occupied himself. I mean, he's acting like he hates you, which doesn't make sense considering you both are friends. I remember feeling like I hated you for no real reason, too. There was a nervous pause before one final message was sent. Does that make sense? God, he hated that it made sense. He hated that Todoroki was so damn observant. He hated that Todoroki connected the pieces just as Gami had. He hated that he had to face the truth and admit something was most certainly wrong, that something was really targeting the few people he had left. But most of all, Midori hated that he had to come to terms with the fact that he was the common link, that his curse or whatever it was roping the people he cared about into his mess, that it really was his fault. He didn't know if his heart wanted to stop beating, or his lungs wanted to stop breathing, or his brain wanted to stop thinking, but some unholy combination of it all was making his stomach want to start retching. Midori's fingers wavered as he swallowed back some bile and guilt like he was a rookie hero downing shots. I guess. He did not elaborate further. Thankfully, Todoroki didn't press him any further, and almost disappointingly, no more buzzes came from his phone. Still, he couldn't hide the way his hands had trembled, as much as he clutched them in his lap like a child. So when he finally felt the cold embrace of a ghostly air that he'd been so desperately waiting for, he nearly cried out in relief. I apologize. I thought that distracting you from the issue would be more helpful, but I shall bite the bullet instead. Gami sighed, a resigned breath of chill. I think Iida is infected with the same affliction that we believe Todoroki, Bakugo, and perhaps Kiori Ryodai all experienced as well. And while Midori was so relieved to feel validated by his mentor, who had been ignoring the very obvious issue at hand, he was so afraid of what that admission would entail, because something was very concerning and wrong with Iida, and thinking back to how jarring his experience was with rescuing Todoroki from his hate, Midori's stomach churned at the thought of doing it all over again. And maybe it was selfish to worry about how awful Iida might make him feel, just as Todoroki unknowingly had, but he still feared it nonetheless. He didn't want to feel like he'd lost anyone else, because all the times before were enough. Right now, we need to sit back and evaluate. The process of freeing Todoroki was not only tedious, but required an outside reason to get through to him. While we wait for those conditions to be satisfied for Iida, it is best to keep out of his way. No need to unnecessarily escalate any violence. Midori was reminded that not only did he have no idea why this was happening to the people he cared about, forcing him to watch them hate him until he eventually figured out how to stop it, but also that this all escalated into wanting to kill him, or at least hurt him in some way. His shoulders slumped depressingly, and he fought every urge to bawl right then and there. Having to do all this with Todoroki was enough. Having to hear Todoroki admit to hating him, to wanting to hurt him, to even wanting to try to kill him. Wasn't that all enough? He didn't want to do it all again, not with someone he held so closely to his heart. It hit him all of a sudden, in an awkward and violent way, that this was just going to keep happening. He didn't see any end in sight. It was just a road paved with new hardships. Wasn't it enough that most people who he was close to ended up dead or gone? Wasn't the fact that he'd been humanly alone most of his life enough? Why did he now need to worry about losing the few people important to him to some unnatural violence and hate? Why? A shift in the cool atmosphere reminded him that Gami still had his arms draped around him, now laying himself over his shoulders. At least he'd always have one. At least he'd always have him. Though the mood had long been shot, once by Iida's outburst and once more by Midoriya's silence, Todoroki did his best to salvage what he could, corralling Midoriya into a light conversation. They talked in hushed breaths, and Midoriya had to resist looking up to see Iida's harsh gaze every time he laughed. For 45 minutes, Gami watched as Todoroki, consciously or not, shielded his successor from his stress, from Iida, from a world that constantly wanted to beat him down. Gami watched Midoriya laugh, even when 5 feet away from what was making his hands shake a moment before, and, gratefully, Gami watched Midoriya be taken care of in a moment where he could not. The ghost made sure to ruffle his hair lovingly before relaxing and looking out the window for the last end of the ride. He really did like train rides. Attention, the train will be approaching Yamanashi momentarily. Please do not stand until the train comes to a full and complete stop. Thank you for riding with us. Midoriya and Todoroki both looked up at the announcement, reading the same information on the screen above before it really sank in. Well, that's my stop, he admitted, gathering his backpack and briefcase on the neighboring seat, the train starting to slow down with an obnoxious screech. Good luck on your internship. Let me know how it goes. Of course. Todoroki nodded, though it looked more like a neck snap as the train had jolted to a stop. The same to you as well. Stay safe. Midoriya stood up with a smile, flashing it to his friend behind him before making his way out of the exit doors. He paused for a moment, his mind wandering toward Iida, wanting so badly to say something to him as well, but he solemnly decided against it. He stepped off the train and onto the slightly shaky metal platform. The station was just a walk away, just a few steps as he'd be on to his next adventure, but almost like it was a natural instinct, Midoriya waited until the train doors behind him hissed shut. The train started to peel away from the station when he turned around, just barely catching a small wave goodbye from Todoroki. He hoped that his friend was able to catch his wave back as the train rushed further and further from sight. Gami swirled around him, nudging him toward the station. I do not wish to rush you, but... Midoriya sighed knowingly, readjusting his backpack as he reached to pull out Gran Torino's offer, complete with an address. No, you're right. He looked out from the paper, locking eyes with the entrance to the station, his hands buzzed from underneath his gloves, anticipation running through his veins as naturally as DT did. He wasn't sure if his antsiness was the result of excitement, worry, or a mixture of the two, because he was so excited to learn from someone like Gran Torino, someone who could cultivate him 1,000,000 years beyond what he could do on his own. But he wasn't sure if that desire for control came out of his own eagerness to improve or the inevitability of having to protect the people he cared about from himself. Honestly, it was probably all of that. It was all of the want to succeed, the want to protect, the want to save. It was the want to prevent the Ishiharas of the world. It was the want to support the Todorokis of the world. It was the want to fight for the Iidas of the world. Ready for the next step. And it was the hope that there would be no more to cleanse after him. Yeah, to the next step. For such a grand hero, Midoriya wasn't sure what he was doing in a place like this. From the station, he and Gami had relied on nothing more than the map on his phone to get the address on Gran Torino's offer, and unless the app was hell-bent on taking them through the most desolate, apocalyptic parts of the city, the teen had to triple-check he was going the right way. But sure enough, they were only a block away from the correct address, so he held back his uncertainties and kept pushing forward. The streets were barer than empty. Spiderweb cracks followed his feet with every step. Lonely silence trickled through the air. Not even a breeze passed through the Death Valley between the city. He wasn't even sure if the roads were still open. He hadn't seen a single car, even crossed the neighboring streets. Normally, Midoriya found peace in a kind of solitude like this, after all. Dagoba was his favorite hangout spot, but this was a stretch, even for him and his unworldly tolerance. Even Gami, who enjoyed this kind of atmosphere far more than he did, looked put off by the sheer level of abandon. We are going in the right direction, correct? Gami asked for the millionth time, readjusting his grip on Midoriya's briefcase. This area was so dead, the duo didn't even feel the need to worry about some passerby noticing a seemingly floating briefcase trailing after a high school boy. That's what my phone says. Midori couldn't even be annoyed with his mentor, not with the way that he was struggling to stay confident himself. He looked down at the map, stopping with a jolt of shock. Actually, it says we're here. He craned his head out of the screen, matching Gami's gaze upward at the building that they stopped in front of. You must be joking. And by the way, his eyes had landed on a building that appeared as if it had come out of a nuclear blast. More shattered windows than not, complete chunks missing like an unsolved puzzle that had been given up on, surrounded by faded construction barriers, weakly guarding the perimeter, half of the welcome sign that had adorned the doorway threatening to fall and crush him if he wasn't careful. Midoriya really wished he was. He pulled out the offer again, holding it close to his phone screen, and sure enough, the addresses did match. In disbelief, Gami set down the briefcase on the broken sidewalk and peered over his shoulder, grumbling something under his breath that was most certainly not a curse word. The ghost flew closer to the building, trying to look through one of the cracked windows and the gaps in the door, but by the way he returned dejectedly, it was no avail. Well, Midori picked up the briefcase Gami had dropped. It can't hurt to knock. The teen trudged up to the crumbling steps, extra careful of his footing and his position relative to the dangerously teetering overhead sign. He spent about a second searching for a doorbell to press before pausing, then face-palming at his own stupidity. Nervously, he instead raised a fist to the rotted door, just a few inches from its surface. Hello? I'm here from UA High School, he rapped gently on the door. I'm Midori Izuku. You sent me a... The front door screeched open from his knock. Interrupting his shaky statement, he and Gami had peeked inside briefly, unable to see much from their angle, but from what they could observe, the space had seemed much more stable on the inside. Not necessarily pretty, but definitely more structurally sound than the outside. At this point, we might as well let ourselves in. Gami shrugged and floated through the ajar door with little care, his ghostly form passing through multiple objects to enter the main space. I don't think that this is a good idea, Midori hissed under his breath, but he still pushed the door open slightly more, if nothing more than just to keep better tabs on his mentor. You may want to get in here. And just as the teen had pushed the door ajar some more, the main space, along with the unmoving body of a small old man, was revealed. Shit! Midori rushed into the building. Stepping past shards of broken plate and splatters of red, he knelt at the man's side, hands hovering shakily over his face-down form. He hadn't received a premonition for anyone resembling his stature, but his visions had been pretty preoccupied with the hero killer's murders currently. Did that mean this incident was too tame for a premonition? Was this simply his time? He cursed the finicky nature of his powers under his breath. It would be so much easier if they just stayed consistent. He took a deep breath. Panicking would achieve absolutely nothing, so it wasn't worth his time. Gami had returned to his side at this point, awkwardly floating beside him. Looking to him for guidance and receiving a particularly unhelpful shrug, Midori decided to at least check for a pulse. Even if it was weak, that might mean that he'd have a chance. I'm alive! Midori screeched a very unheroic scream as he lurched back in surprise, landing crudely on his rear and staining his uniform pants in red ketchup. As the old man stood himself up with the use of his dejected cane, he saw that underneath him were strands of sausage links, combined with plate shards, and was this just an unfortunate accident? But why was he laying so helplessly without response for such a long time? The man, who Midori had to assume was Gran Torino, despite every fiber of his being begging that to be false, looked up at him unsteadily with a hunched back. Who are you? Gami sneakily helped his successor back up, watching him try to wipe the ketchup off his pants to no avail. He tried to help as best as he could, but even with more solidity than usual, there was no way that stuff was coming off without a good wash. Sighing disappointedly, Midori looked nervously at the hero in front of him, unsure of whether to offer any assistance in cleaning up. I'm Midori Izuku, from UA. Gran Torino cocked his head. What? He shuffled uncomfortably. Midori Izuku? Gran Torino paused to think for a moment. Who are you? Oh, you have to be kidding me. And yeah, Midoriya had to painfully agree. Gran Torino stared up at him blankly before plopping back on his rear right back into the puddle of ketchup, splattering more onto the cuffs of Midori's uniform pants. I want to eat some food. Midoriya sucked in a deep breath, stilling his frustrations under a mask of tolerance, so Gran Torino was not what he was expecting. To be fair, he did have some high expectations with him being revered and even feared of a teacher of All Mights, and that's coming from the #1 hero himself. But it certainly wasn't wrong to expect someone competent. Still, the dwindling optimism in his head pushed the idea that maybe he was just a little slower now than he was before. He was past his prime. After all, he'd still managed to fill out an internship offer and have that sent to him at UA. That had to show some intent, right? So he set down his briefcase that he unconsciously had picked up when he stood up from the floor, taking a cautious step forward and extending a hand of assistance. "Please, sir, you sent me an internship and—" "Toshinori," Gran Torino interrupted. "Is that you?" No," Midoriya laughed nervously. "I'm going to step out really quick." He started to edge his way to the open door, giving Gami a sideways glance of desperation. Instantly, the ghost was at his side, his body language alone enough for Midoriya to know that he was at his limit. "I am going to kill that man," he seethed, shaking his fists with emotion unlike his nonchalant form, though as of late Gami couldn't help but notice how emotional he was becoming. "It's not his fault," Midoriya whispered, eyeing the hero who was now opening his briefcase. "He's what, like 70? "No, not him, though I am about to." Gami gestured toward the pocketed offer with attitude. "I am going to kill All Might, that buffoon of a man. I thought perhaps that he had truly changed, but to send you here with him—" "I chose to come here. This was my decision. Besides, All Might probably didn't even know. He said he hadn't heard from him in—" "So, Toshinori sent you here?" Gran Torino didn't look up from the opened briefcase, and yet instead stopped Midoriya in his tracks. "Let me see what you can do, then." The duo froze instinctively, but thankfully it didn't seem like Gran Torino cared all too much for their side conversation. Midoriya had gotten sneakier with his words as well, molding them to seem like he simply talked to himself in an unhealthy degree. And when compared to the alternative, he didn't mind owning that stereotype that he already embodied naturally. "What is with the sudden personality shift?" Well, I'm not sure that's a good idea." Midori couldn't help but think the same thing. Was he really just a senile old man, or had he been playing him from the start? Still, he wasn't really comfortable fighting Gran Torino in his current state. But the elder simply chuckled nonsensically. "Nonsense. You've got a nice costume here. Now come and fight me." Midori looked back at Gami, but he seemed equally lost, the atmospheric whiplash much too disorienting. Overwhelmed by mixed signals, he moved to at least retrieve his briefcase, unsure of whether he was going to listen to Gran Torino or not, but was startled away when the hero snapped to him. "Who are you again?" Gami growled aggressively, like a rabid animal, and honestly, Midori couldn't blame him. His patience was falling apart in front of him as Gran Torino shuffled through the items of his hero costume, pulling things out of place with no respect for him and his seriousness. He clenched his hands, feeling DT pull dangerously under his gloved fingertips, wanting nothing more than to be released violently, but instead of snarling and biting the savage animal of his own decay wanted him to, he exhaled, deeply, trying to regain at least a bit of control. "I don't have time for this." Gami and Gran Torino both looked at him, both shifting uncertainly, both giving completely different vibes. "The world isn't slowing down for anyone. The people I care about are struggling. Until I learn how to control my power, I'm failing them." Until he learned how to control decay, he was just a constant threat to them. Until he learned how to fight with his scythe, he was a constant hindrance to them. Until he learned how to manage his immortal body, he was a constant liability to them. Until he learned how to optimize his premonitions, he was a constant failure to them. And until he learned how to utilize himself in a way that left no one worrying, not even him, he needed to improve. "I trusted in All Might when he gave me your offer, something I thought I'd never do again. I trusted him when he asked me to give you a chance, when I was told by him that you could help me to learn to control my blasts." Midoriya's stone-cold eyes had burned with hardened fury, flooded with the DT that ran secretly through his veins. "I'm here because I need to improve, and was given an adamant recommendation toward you, but right now I see none of that. So, unless you're done playing around, I'm done fooling around." For one of the few times in his life, Midoriya held firm against the unblinking stare of adult authority. He was so used to running and cowering from people much more powerful than him because that's how he was used to surviving. But the spark of defiance he experienced standing against All Might that fateful day opened him up to a new way of living. He didn't have to sit and take anyone's bullshit anymore. He was strong and worthy of respect, and if people didn't agree, then he didn't need them. And when he stood up for himself against All Might, against Endeavor, even against Gran Torino right now, boy did it feel good. He hoped he wasn't power-tripping, but if that's what this was, he wasn't sure he could cut it out of his life now. Gran Torino stared dumbly at him, and Midoriya figured he wasn't going to get an answer. "Come on, We'll get a train ticket home and figure things out from there." Gami placed a hand on his successor's shoulder, starting to lead him to the door. "I am sure that Eraserhead will understand." But Gami's words were cut off, and so was their path out, as in less than a blink Gran Torino ricocheted around the room before landing atop the doorway. Crashes and bangs still ringing out in Midoriya's ears as the passing breeze remained fluttering through his hair. Instinctively, he jumped back slightly, just enough to put some room between them, and lowered himself into a defensive position. "Got some backbone there, huh?" Gran Torino snapped with such life burning in his eyes, Midoriya had to make sure that he himself was still standing. "But who are you to be demanding anything in this world when you barely are a pebble on this mountain?" Midoriya couldn't bring himself to respond, still momentarily stunned. Even Kami, who had a remark for everything, merely floated silently at his side. All they could do was stare at the way Gran Torino had sunk his hands into the concrete wall and the way that his cape fluttered in the aftermath of a phantom wind. "That way you used your quirk during the sports festival was the same way I first found Toshinori. Astounding power, piss-poor control, and a desire to save that this world is going to try its damnedest to beat out of you." The old man grinned in a way that took decades off his age. "I was the only teacher at UA that could handle a quirk like Toshinori's, and I doubt they've found anyone to cover that kind of power since I left, so I hope you're ready to cover everything that I taught him in just a week, because I won't be pulling punches." Even after his instincts had calmed down, Midoriya couldn't relax in the way Gran Torino's eyes pierced straight through him. He could no longer see a senile old man that couldn't tell the difference between a bird and a bull even if it hit him in the face. Now the gaze of a pro-hero met his own. A hero who had seen, felt, and fought his whole life. The intensity alone was enough to rock him to his core. "Now put on that costume and let's get on with it." And that was all Midoriya needed to hear for him to grab his open briefcase and rush to the nearest empty room to change. Gami followed suit, though not before muttering something under his breath about getting tired of tricksters. Still, he was a little behind, and that meant floating through a closed door. "You did not even bother to wait for me. I am hurt." Midoriya shrugged with a smirk as he pulled out the items of his costume. "You'd come on your own, case in point." Curiously, he pulled out a small pamphlet of paper that was stuffed to the side of the briefcase, probably knocked out of place by Gran Torino's rummaging. He held it close to his face to read the small print to himself, scanning it over quickly before looking back to the costume parts he pulled out. "Looks like the support course made some changes as they were repairing my costume." Obviously. The teen shot him a glare. They were indeed some hard-to-miss changes. The body of his costume was a much darker shade than before, mostly black at this point. The support team must have removed a lot of the brown straps that adorned the jumpsuit before. Most notably, the shiny iron knee pads were out of sight, and instead worked into the jumpsuit themselves. Even the bubbled clocks that used to be on the sides of his steel-toed boots were removed, giving his costume a much sleeker and stealthier look overall, but there were some other changes Midoriya had to look harder for. For one, a set of coattails had been added right at the base of the spine. They were longer than he first realized, almost reaching his calves when he stretched his costume out, and thick too. If he squatted or lowered himself into one of his usual defensive positions, the coattails would probably shield all of his legs. And being just as dark as the jumpsuit itself, that probably was to increase his stealth capabilities as well. He was starting to see an overall theme here, and it wasn't the steampunk ideas they first supplied for his costume, though with the coattails and not a full cloak, he guessed his support course team had an aesthetic they had in mind. Still, he would be lying if he said it hadn't grown on him at this point. Midoriya stripped himself of all the layers of his costume before pulling on the main body of it. It was a bit of a tighter fit than before, but nothing uncomfortable. Less loose fabric meant less things that he could get snagged on or grabbed by. And while the long coattails kind of balanced out any advantages from the fittedness, their stealth perks had made up for it. He reached back into the briefcase for his utility belt and remarked with thoughtful surprise when he realized they'd changed that too, but before he had just a belt at his waist and a corresponding belt at his thigh, with a small fastened bag that dangled between them. It certainly looked cool, but in a practical sense it was loose and noisy. The new belt was very thick in width, hugging around his entire waist, with a smaller fastened pouches all the way around. It was self-contained, quiet, and secure, and fully stocked with basic medical supplies to boot. They certainly did make a lot of changes. Gami floated around, casually observing the pieces of the costume Midoriya had on, and then nosily moved to ruffle through the briefcase with limited success. "Oh, look at this." The teen turned to see Gami holding up what looked to be his short cloak as best as he could, only to drop it, or for it to phase through his grip more accurately, before he could really get a look at it. "Well, Midori giggled, crouching down to pick it back up, confirming his theory as well about the coattails as they shrouded his legs completely in shadow. Holding out the short cloak, he wasn't sure it could be called that anymore. For one, it was much longer than previously, going past his elbows completely, but what really had his eyes glowing was the tall neck of the fabric. Excitedly, he unfastened the buttons and slipped it around his shoulders, clasping it back together and letting the neck fall naturally. Oh, this is nice. Good eye. He wasn't really sure why the neck alone had him grinning like a toddler, but he'd always held some fondness for turtlenecks in his life, and the fact that this one had reached all the way past his chin and up toward his mouth had some childish dopamine triggering in his brain. He wasn't expecting the ghost to jump before responding. Ah, I apologize. It is difficult to tell that you are speaking directly to me without being able to see your mouth. Oh, you can't? He didn't realize the neck covered that much, nor that his lips was so important to speech recognition. That's kind of cool, actually. I suppose. He shrugged, looking back at the briefcase. There is still something else here. Confused, he looked over as well. There was no more parts to his costume, at least no more parts in comparison to the first design. He reached in, pulling it out and holding it up for them both to see. Midori cocked his head. It's a hat? Indeed it was, a dark, wide-brimmed hat. He shuffled it around in his grasp, unsure of how to feel about it. It was a bit much, even for what he knew the support course had liked to add, and how would it stay on his head? Maybe the support team had some kind of hidden gimmick put into it. They usually did. Still, he grumbled. As he moved around the hat, another piece of paper had fluttered out from the inside. Gami moved around to look over his shoulder, as he picked it up off the floor and unfolded it to read. Midoriya, while the support course was repairing and redesigning your costume, I figured I'd add in some details of my own that I thought you'd find useful. The tall neck and hat combination should hide your expression as well as your mouth well enough so that you may have sneaky conversations with those nearby, should you keep your voice low enough. I'd assume you would have no trouble with that. Think of it as a thank you for your help during the USJ incident, in tandem with your new gloves. Enjoy. Principal Nezu. Of course that cheeky rodent had something to do with these changes, Gami murmured. He cannot keep out of messing with your business. That may be true, Midoriya offhandedly agreed. All times Nezu made him feel a bit more uncomfortable flashing through his mind. But you got to admit, this is surprisingly thoughtful of him, like the gloves. With a swift, sudden movement, he plopped the hat onto his messy bed of hair and pushed it down in the hopes that it would stay. Popping his collar just to make sure that the neck covered his mouth, he grinned a hidden grin at his mentor. Are you smiling at me, or it appears that you are staring oddly at me? Perfect. He'd kept Gran Torino waiting long enough. It was time to move on and move forward. He opened back up the door and left for the main space as Gami had trailed behind him. So I can still see some of the steampunk style from before, but now you have this plague doctor thing going on. He didn't pay attention to whatever Gami was going on about. The ghost seemed to be doing a lot of that lately. Instead, he stopped in the center of the main space, where Gran Torino was patiently waiting for him, having dusted himself off. Took you long enough. The elder bit. Steam doctor. No, that sounds dumb. Midori chuckled awkwardly. Sorry, I got some new additions to my costume. Is that so? Gran Torino raised an eyebrow. You better hope that's enough. Plague punk. I like that, actually. Midori shifted nervously as Gran Torino raised his chin to flash a toothy grin. 'Cause like I said, I'm not pulling any punches. Before Midori could even register, the blasts of wind from before had returned, only this time they lasted longer than just a moment. His eyes bounced around as he desperately tried to follow the yellow blur to no avail. Gran Torino's movement was incredible, almost unearthly. Sure, Iida was faster than the elder man, easily, but he tended to move very blatantly, which was very easy enough to follow with a moment of notice. But this chaotic hurricane of air and sound, he couldn't even attempt to follow this unless he had a time-bending quirk. He wasn't prepared at all when a boot slammed violently into his back, causing him to stumble with a shout of surprise. He tried to catch Gran Torino on the offbeat, hoping to swing the match back to his favor, but the hero didn't even give him the chance. Back was the overwhelming rush of wind in every direction, and Midoriya started to back himself to the wall, trying to at least get one of his sides covered from fire. His eyes unsuccessfully continued to track Gran Torino's path, despite knowing how fruitless the whole thing was. Do you want my assistance, or would you rather I— Yes, he hissed from the confines of his collar. You're my partner, I need you. He wasn't able to finish that, though, as Gran Torino bodied him again, ramming right into his stomach. Midori choked impulsively, starting to fall onto his knees. Before his mind came back to him, he braced on all fours, scrambling like a scavenger like he was used to. "What is this?" Gran Torino snarked. "I thought we were fighting." Midori growled, but could do nothing as the hero stomped his back yet again. Gami tried to ram his shoulder into the small man to throw him off balance, but was far too slow to make contact. Gran Torino bounced around some more before landing on and crashing through his microwave. "You spoke all that crap about getting serious, but now you're the one fooling around." Gami took the opportunity to run his hands through the shambles of the appliance and yank it forward with all his might. He wasn't as solid as he'd hoped, as evident by the way he struggled to hold the pieces of his successor's costume before, but his force managed to interact with it. The crumbling microwave jerked suddenly, spooking Gran Torino off and back into the air, muttering something about faulty tech, but that was all Midori needed to get back on his feet, only to be shoved back down once more. He caught himself with a grunt and a knee. Gami was swirling around him, trying to catch Gran Torino, but Midori knew that wasn't going to work. Right now there was no way he could keep up with the pro. He simply didn't have the capabilities to do so, and without some cover to really stop and think, he was going to keep getting beat down until he couldn't stand anymore. He could take a beat down, far better than a typical person could at least, but this still wasn't a winning situation for him. One hand toyed with the other's glove precariously. If he didn't have cover, then he needed to halt Gran Torino's movements in place of that. He pulled off his right glove, letting it flutter to the floor as he readied himself in a random direction. He wasn't going to catch Gran Torino face to face, but the elder had struck him in the back multiple times now. He favored sneak attacks in combination with hit-and-run tactics. Midori understood. He fought very similarly. He tried to still his breathing, to focus on the rushes of air around him, to focus on welling up DT in his fingertips. If he could get off one explosion, that might be enough to reset tempo back to him. He didn't have Recovery Girl to heal him if things went wrong. He could afford to get things wrong, but he also couldn't afford to keep getting beat down without even trying. A wave of air had stormed directly behind him, and he took a moment to run through the memories of the USJ, the feelings of the sports festival, in hopes that would be enough. He pivoted roughly on his heels, bending his knees suddenly to kill his balance. He would fall, but Gran Torino would fly right over him, and his unguarded hand. "Blast him out of the sky." Gami followed his plan. "Then I shall slam him to the ground." Midori grit his teeth, trying to regulate DT pulling in his blood. It was all slow motion. He raised his arm, stretching out his fingers, clomped down on grit and the flesh of his cheek, and lined up as Gran Torino had flew out over him. Please. What he didn't account for was Gran Torino to suddenly halt his path with a strategic burst of air and grab his outstretched arm in one swift second. His concentration was immediately broken as he was thrown harshly into the floor by his arm. Gran Torino pinned his head with the other hand, and he had pressed one foot deeper into his chest and was using the other to steady himself in case Midori had tried to buck him off. But the teen knew he lost this one. "Damn it, I thought I had you." It was a surprise Gran Torino even understood his muffled complaints from under his hand. "I'll admit your analysis and prediction almost got me. They're probably your strongest assets as of now." The elder man led up, loosening his grip on Midori as he moved to straighten himself. "But your movements are too rigid. Watching you during the obstacle race made me think at first that you had the capabilities for fine movement, but you struggled during the cavalry battle and the one-on-one because you lacked mobility and in turn reactability." Gran Torino walked away, allowing the teen to sit up and catch his breath. Gami helped him up, cradling his abused back, which ached now that he was on low adrenaline. He reached for his dejected glove and slipped it back on, both comfortable and disappointed at the way his DT had retreated back under his skin. "You say you need to improve to get stronger, but you're failing to hone what you have now. You remind me too much of Toshinori, eager to rush to the next milestone without optimizing what you've already got. And while he has the strength to subdue villains in place of control, your quirk is a bit more complicated than that." "Yeah," Midori sighed with heaviness in his heart. "Toshinori's All Might, right? Just making sure I only know him as Yagi." Gran Torino nodded. "Yagi Toshinori. Really has been too long since I've spoken to him." The old hero paused to grab his cane. "You got a connection to Toshinori I should know about?" Midori paused, brain loading for a moment. "Oh, no. I mean, I know about him and everything, but I needed to do this with my power alone. We got off on the wrong foot, but things are better now. That's about all the relationship we have." Gran Torino understood without question. "I figured. I didn't notice anything more during your sports festival performance, but I wanted to make sure. Regardless, I gave you an offer for what I saw during that festival. Nothing more, nothing less." And unconsciously, something heavy in the teen's heart had lifted. First All Might, then Shinso, now him. Feels like a season of redemption. So, tell me about your path. You came here with a goal in mind. I could see that from the start. What are you hoping to get out of this week? Well, he started. I'm sure you know the basics of my quirk. The elder waved a hand. Yeah, you've got an unrestricted decay and access to a scythe. Very offensively threatening stuff. Offensively threatening was a nice way of putting it, but Midori appreciated it nonetheless. I figured out recently that I can make explosions by decaying the air, but every time I've tried to utilize it, I end up seriously hurting myself. I think the problem is that I'm releasing too much power at once, but I haven't been successful with forcing it out, Midori explained with a bit of disappointment in his voice. I know this is exactly the non-deadly offensive potential that I'm missing, but I'm feeling stuck. Gran Torino thought for a moment, tapping his stick rhythmically against the tile flooring. Gami took the time to look over his successor for injuries, gently running through his hair as a sign of silent support. Midori couldn't ask for a better partner, and he sure as hell couldn't be part of a better team. So, you decay things by feeling them? Through the physical contact? He asked rhetorically, not waiting for the confirmation. Have you tried feeling the air? The teen blinked, dialing up a response. Feeling the air? How do I even do that? Gran Torino shrugged half-heartedly, suddenly making his way to the front door as he had closed it earlier before their fight. I don't know. Figure it out yourself. With a sharp twist, he pushed the door open, uncaring to Midori's shell-shocked expression. I'll be back. I'm stepping out to eat. And the hero left, without another word, closing the door behind him. Midori hadn't been able to even sputter out anything in defiance, left lost and alone among a wreckage of crumbling concrete, tipped furniture, and one fucked-up microwave. His mind reeled from the whiplash, eyes unconsciously searching for the clock that was propped up on the kitchen counter that had been miraculously spared in the fray. It had only been an hour since he'd arrived. 1 hour out of the 7 days that he was here to stay. And I take back what I said. Midori had tried for the rest of the day to feel the air, or whatever the hell that meant, trying to muster up the idea over the sensation, and he wanted so desperately to just try and force out a blast, begging for that instant gratification, but he had no way to heal himself if he was stupid enough to get hurt, and rendering himself unable to continue on the first of 7 days would only make him feel worse, so he resisted that urge. Besides, he was here to learn control. He was here to learn how to feel the air, not how to fry his nerves. That didn't mean that he was successful, however. Gami had to drag him out of the neighboring alleyway and back to the shamble of the building Gran Torino called a home. The elder had long since returned from his food-motivated outing, evident by the empty takeout boxes that had littered the living room floor as the duo walked in. The main space was still a complete mess from before. It didn't look like Gran Torino had bothered to try to clean it up at all. He didn't even acknowledge Midori as he walked in, sweaty, exhausted, and completely fed up. Needless to say, the teen bit back an exasperated groan of frustration as he headed straight for the shower. Gami was kind enough to leave his backpack waiting for him at the edge of the bathroom door, so his relaxing shower wasn't completely in vain when he would have realized that he'd forgotten to take a change of clothes in with him, though he wasn't kind enough to spare him that knowing look as he walked out of the bathroom with an armful of his costume in defeat. Come on. Gami beckoned him along. I am sure that you are hungry after today. I want to hang this up first. He gestured to his arm of clothing, suddenly pausing with realization. And I don't know where I'm sleeping. The ghost hummed thoughtfully as Midori resisted the urge to facepalm, partially because he had no free hands to do so with. Can you hold this for a second? I'll be right back. Gami nodded, holding out his skeletal arms and wispily cradling the decently folded pile of clothing. He remained hidden around the corner of the hallway as his successor had inched back into the main space. Gran Torino, he called out nervously from around the bend. Where am I staying? The elder waved dismissively at him, not bothering to look away from the television. Just pick a room. I own the building, but anything above the second floor is probably too crummy to sleep in. Midori figured Gran Torino wasn't waiting on a thank you, so he didn't give one. Hey, you hear that? He whispered as he slinked back down the hall. You can pick the room if you want. Only to find his companion trying unsuccessfully to pick up the same pile of clothing that he was supposed to be holding. Gami gave him a sheepish look, his arms once again phasing through the costume. I would like that, as well as some assistance. He laughed under his breath, picking up the fallen costume from the floor, as well as his bag and briefcase that were leaning on the bathroom door. They'd look through the less-than-ideal rooms, ignoring the one that looked lived in, that was more likely Gran Torino's. Gami decided on the one without a window, and whilst Midori would have liked the morning sun or the midnight moon, He could live with the dim artificial light that his mentor had preferred. Plus, the artificial window may or may not be contributing to the structural instability of the whole room. It was something that he was glad he didn't have to worry about. He set his things down, not so much worrying about unpacking the little he had. He put aside his costume on few flimsy hangers that he'd found in the poorest excuse for a wardrobe he'd ever seen, and they left for the main space. Midori was reminded of the awful state of the main area in the kitchen as he walked back in. Gran Torino seemed not to mind the mess, but it was really starting to get under his skin. There was nothing specifically that unnerved him so, other than maybe the natural human discomfort in seeing a microwave so mangled beyond repair. He guessed it was probably his instinct to keep his mother's home neat and clean that had him reeling at the opposite. That commodity, necessary to survive, morphed into some twisted comfort that followed him even now. Sometimes he found himself missing his mother and her home, but when he really stopped to entertain those homesick thoughts, he never actually missed either. He missed the idea of home, the idea of Mom, the few fading memories of her smile that he had left, but he never really missed her. He supposed him putting it that way was the most accurate he could to getting that feeling put into words. But Midori knew if he admitted any of that out loud, he was sure that no one would really understand. That was okay. He didn't expect them to. "Gran Torino, where did you order takeout from?" he hesitantly asked, a little afraid of interrupting whatever he was watching. "If you want to order dinner, I'll clean up the kitchen while we wait so that we can use it for the rest of the week." He wasn't expecting the hero to scoff out a laugh. "Order? You think that any takeout deliveries come to this neighborhood? What do you think I left to go get food for?" Midori's stomach dropped, which wasn't a very pleasant experience considering it was both very hungry and very aggravated. "There's stuff in the fridge and the pantry. Take what you'd like. If you want to clean the kitchen, then all I've got is a broom in the back closet. You can dump the microwave. I already ordered a new one." And that was all he gave before returning to the television mindlessly. "Oh, for the love of—" "Let's just see what there is to work with," Midori mumbled under his breath, moving toward the small pantry. It was just as underwhelming as he expected, despite his attempts to remain optimistic. Nothing but loose packets of tea, stale crackers, and a half-eaten jar of peanut butter. He was just about to shut the door and move on until Gami hesitantly motioned toward the tea bags. The ghost didn't say anything. A little confused, Midori reached for one of the packets. He nearly fumbled with it upon realizing it was Shinsha tea, and not some matcha tea he was expecting. This stuff was hard to come by, always in limited supply due to its short window of harvest. He'd personally never had it. It was always out of his budget of reasonability. He didn't expect a minimalist like Gran Torino to have this in the back of his pantry. He was about sure that he shouldn't touch this. It almost didn't feel right. But then again, Gran Torino did say he could have anything he found, and he'd only have one. Some small level of entitlement in him felt it was worth it since the hero didn't bother to tell him about his food situation until after he'd showered and changed into loungewear. Besides, it was long since the harvest period, so it was probably already stale to some degree. So he set a bag down for himself, closing the pantry behind him. He moved to try and find something of substance in the fridge to actually eat. He didn't notice how Gami stayed behind, eerily focused on the tea that he just placed on the counter. The fridge wasn't much better. Nearly as scarce and barren as the pantry, there was a carton of milk, a couple of eggs, some jam, really nothing special, until he noticed some boxed taiyaki in the back, and he was pretty sure that this stuff belonged in the freezer. But he figured this was probably the best meal that he was going to get today, even if it was a little soggy. Then Midori remembered the broken microwave situation. He'd have to figure out another way to heat them up. He'd say this day couldn't get any worse, but that would just be jinxing it, honestly. He took out the box. Maybe if he found some aluminum paper or a tray, he could warm the taiyaki in the oven. It would probably be less than satisfying, but at this point, he was just hungry. There were worse things to eat. He'd had them. Luckily enough, he found a tray to use, so he didn't have to get desperate with tinfoil or anything, and on the plus side, he pulled out a kettle to boil some water with. It was in pretty favorable condition compared to the rest of the house in general, so he really couldn't complain as much as it bubbled up within him. So he placed the taiyaki in the oven and filled the kettle on the stovetop, only to realize that he had to wait anyway, and then he remembered the mess. "Might as well get the broom," Midori grumbled, leaving to find the closet in this unfamiliar and frankly ruinous maze of a place. Ami stayed behind, transfixed on the tea bag that laid on the counter. He knew his successor had left on his own, and he hadn't bothered to follow him. It was a short trip. He didn't need to be hanging all over the boy for everything. Midori was more than independent on his own. Those were all the things that Gami kept telling himself to justify what he was feeling. And as true as they all were individually, he knew that they were just excuses in his head. He couldn't pull himself away even if he wanted to. He saw the tea, and something important in him resonated like the sharp echo of a church bell. His heart knew why it was important, but his head still didn't quite grasp it at all, and that left his soul pulled tautly in two directions. Midori came back with the broom, and he had noticed at this point the odd behavior of his mentor, but he couldn't really address it with Gran Torino a few feet away, so instead he settled for sweeping the problem aside, much like he swept away the remnants of the fight from earlier, piling up the stray concrete powder so that he could take care of it later. He picked up some toppled furniture, a lamp with its shade permanently askew, the small table it sat upon. The chair was what he was going to sit in to eat. He considered how to get rid of the microwave. It would be easier to just disintegrate it and sweep it up in the dust. He was sure that Gran Torino wouldn't care. He just wanted it gone, after all. It felt strange to use his powers outside of a tense combat situation. He didn't think that there was a time where he decayed something that wasn't for training or his own survival. He ran a bare hand down and along the fractured side of the appliance, almost feeling bad. The shrill of the kettle snapped him out of his thoughts, startling Gami out of his as well. Midori stepped away from the microwave, taking some time to pull the kettle off the burner. He poured the hot water into the cup, dipping the tea bag into it to soak. The teen returned back to the microwave after giving it a comforting pat. He gave in to the urges of the DT that he'd restrained for the whole day. He pushed the dust off of the counter and onto the floor, sweeping it with the rest of the debris he'd pick up later. He figured the taiyaki was done too, so he pulled that out of the oven and shook the pastries onto a plain ceramic plate. Grabbing the small mug of tea, Midori sat himself down, the faint echo of the television from just a few feet over, trickling into the kitchen. He cautiously bit into one of the taiyaki. He'd had worse. It satisfied his stomach, and that was all that mattered. Gami floated over as soon as he took the tea, now standing awkwardly at the side of the table as Midori ate. The teen couldn't really question it, not with Gran Torino so close by, so he just continued to eat as the issue simultaneously ate at him. I cannot smell it. His voice was filled with an emotion Midori had never even heard from the ghost before, and in that moment he decided he didn't want to hear it again. I wish I could smell it. Midori didn't know what to say. He reached for the cup to take a sip, but suddenly his heart wasn't in it anymore. He reached subtly for his mentor's hand. Interlacing his bony fingers with his own, he brought his hand to the side of the cup, pressing it against it in a tight grip. The warmth ebbed from the tea, flowing to his skin, and then away from him once more. He could feel those bony fingers jolt in surprise, but made absolutely no move to get away. Gami reached with his other hand instinctively, but it passed right through. That free hand stuttered before digging into the slack of his robe longingly. That cup of tea sat there, untasted but not untouched until it got cold. Midori finished. He quietly washed the dishes, quietly picked up the pile of dust from the floor, quietly left for his room. He and Gami were finally alone, in the comfort of their own solitude, but they didn't speak a word. The teen just walked through the basics of his nightly routine before curling up in a sleeping bag that Gran Torino had left for him. A familiar set of hands ran through the hair that he didn't bother to comb. A sigh of content had escaped him like a wheeze leaking out of a balloon. Gami didn't say anything, just continued to stroke his long fingers over and over through every knot and tangle until they passed through smoothly, so it felt like they weren't there at all. One hand held the homey nip of undead chill, the safety and love of what had always been his, and the other held the foreign hush of human warmth, the safety and love of what he never knew. Midori whispered out good night, with the last of his awakened breath, drifting off into a peaceful slumber, lulled away by its foreign taste. He thought he felt some innocent kiss on his forehead at the edges of his dreams, but he forgot all about it amidst the siren song of sleep that pulled him under. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 39 of Deku and Death. Chapter 40 will be next. Hope you all are still enjoying this one, and as always, thank you so much for listening.